Okay, the session is now being recorded. Welcome aboard to our sixth module, um, which is on grounded theory. Now, grounded theory is a very involved, very long drawn out process. So in a matter of 2 hours, I'm not going to be able to cover all the aspects, all the facets of grounded theory. It's very, very involved, very structured, and a very theoretical type of process. With all that said, you must also understand that grounded theory is also an inductive approach. And we discussed induction versus deduction. You're looking at individual interviews, individual cases, in-depth analysis of each case, and then summarizing them into some sort of a general observation. And in the case of grounded theory, your generality comes from generating a new theory, okay, where a theory did not already exist, okay, or refining an existing theory. So there are two purposes in grounded theory. Either you come up with a brand new theory where you feel that no theoretical construct was available earlier, which may really not be so much the case because a lot of work has been done over hundreds and hundreds of years on work. So it's likely that what you're trying to introduce as a new theory has already been out there in some way, shape, or form. So you have to be very careful before embarking on a grounded theory. Don't fall in love with this grounded theory. It's a huge, colossal undertaking. And unless you're ready um, for a long drawn out process, which remains tentative for a very long time. What do I mean by that? So if you're in a doctoral program, you have at least 4 or 5 years, sometimes, up to 5.5, 6 years to complete your doctorate. So you have the luxury of time at your hands to go ahead and do a ground theory methodology. If you're doing a master's degree, I would be a little careful before embarking on a grounded theory method because of the intricacy and the involvement and the depth in which you have to go. So, in those cases, if you're so totally sold on grounded theory, and if your research question guides you in the direction of using a grounded theory, then by all means, you can do what is known as an accelerated grounded theory method. Okay, AGTM, an accelerated grounded theory method, versus a grounded theory method here. Substantive grounded theory, formal grounded theory. Don't get confused with these acronyms. They have commonalities, and it is just that the grounded theory method was the original one, and the formal grounded theory one was an offshoot of the original one. So don't get confused with all that, with the terminology. Just remember, try to understand first what is grounded theory, okay? At its very basic. So, um, what is grounded theory? Some of you might ask. How would you define grounded theory? What is it grounded in? What is the objective in pursuing grounded theory? And why were Glaser and Strauss were the original architects of the grounded theory method. They developed and conceptualized the grounded theory method. So I would like to see if anybody has anything to say about that. If you can just answer, you don't have to answer all of them, but if you can answer at least one or two of these questions, we can get the conversation started. So who wants to be first? Believe me, we're not making you a guinea pig here, okay? But if you can, I would like to think of you as a volunteer, a leader who wants to lead the discussion forward. And I would prefer that the more experienced people here, such as the faculty members, allow the students to take a chance, if you don't mind, because I know you guys already know a lot about a lot, and the students are still struggling in learning and finding their way. So I'd like to hear from the students first. And then maybe the faculty members can later join in to clarify or exemplify or elaborate on that. So let's see who wants to go first.
Manali, bolo bhai.
Yes, sir. So can I try?
Yeah, go bolo, Manali. आपका golden hand is up.
Yes, sir.
Hand is full of gold. अबे हमें भी थोड़ा gold भेज दो.
So grounded theory is the process where basically the theory comes out from the data. The theory is already present in the data. And while you're collecting data, you're also analyzing it. So a systematically analyzed data will give out the theory on its own. That's the process.
Okay. Wonderful. And so you said you covered the first two. You defined grounded theory. What is grounded in? It is grounded in the data. The theory is in the data, or the framework is in the theory. When you think of theory, just also think of framework. It may not necessarily be a theory per se. It could be a framework with which you refine and elaborate an existing theory. Okay.
Right.
What is the objective, Manali, in pursuing grounded theory? कर तो रहे हैं grounded theory, पे क्यों कर रहे हैं grounded theory?
Sir, I think that when the data is such, I mean, the phenomena is such that maybe when there has not been much research done on it earlier, or there is no existing theory already, the data that is being collected, it itself can give out the theory which is existing in it. So the question about what are the factors that contribute to this particular phenomena, the factors question is answered through that theory.
Okay, wonderful. That is really awesome. So क्या करें त्रिपाठी साहब, ये सारा जो है वर्कशॉप मनाली से ही करवा लें?
नहीं सर, नहीं।
सारा भाई, अब मेरा ऐसा है, सारा काम तो मनाली ने कर लिया, ठीक है, तो हम इधर क्या करेंगे? हम झक मार रहे हैं भाई? मनाली ने अगर सारा काम कर लिया इधर, राइट ब्रिगेडियर साहब, बताइए, हम तो दुविधा में फंस गए इधर.
नहीं, they have lot to learn from you.
नहीं,
sir, I have a lot to learn.
सारा अगर ये सारा कुछ मनाली ले जाएगी तो हमारी जय जयकार कौन करेगा?
अभी लास्ट सवाल का जवाब नहीं दिया है.
अभी भाई देखा, ब्रिगेडियर साहब ने पकड़ लिया.
सर, लास्ट सवाल का जवाब मुझे सही में नहीं पता. I don't know why glasses and straws came out with this.
सोचो ना, अरे नहीं, ऐसा है कभी नहीं भी पता हो तो थोड़ा झूठ बोल लो यार, क्या पता पर वो करता है. झूठ बोलने में क्या भाई, झूठ बोलने में कोई पैसा लगता है?
नहीं सर, झूठ नहीं, बट मैं अपना पर्सपेक्टिव बता दूं. I think I don't know why they were doing this, but it somehow makes sense. The data is already there. If you just see the data or analyze the data from the perspective of just understanding the data, that's it. उसको बहुत ज्यादा एनालाइज करके वैसे भी नहीं, मतलब सिर्फ you just observe the data, you just understand what people are telling you. The theory is already there in it. So it's actually I think it's a very easy process. Maybe they were just trying to create an easy method of qualitative analysis.
अच्छा, नहीं, आपने बड़ा अच्छी सी बात करी. हम भी थोड़ा ट्राई कर लें?
Yes sir, please sir.
ब्रिगेडियर साहब, हम भी थोड़ा ट्राई कर लें?
Yes sir, yes sir.
अच्छा, तो actually Glaser and Strauss were social scientists, okay, and at the time that they were present and researching and doing the work, everything was about quantitative. all the existing fields were heavily quantitative. Not only that, they were all depending on grand theories that were already produced earlier. Theories of Einstein, theories of, you know, Newton, we talked about, other biological fields, scientific fields. There was a lot of grand theories. Everything was being explained through the lens of that grand theory. And they said there is something wrong with this picture. Why is everybody explaining everything about phenomena through a lens of the existing theory? Why? And what about the data that is already present? What about that data? What is that data leading us to? So they started to wonder if there was another way of looking at something that was so positivist, so structured. They thought perhaps there is some way that we can create a qualitative side to this. Where is the qualitative side coming from? The qualitative side is coming from, well, first of all, the process is inductive. Taking individual interviews, taking individual narratives, and from those narratives, you are trying to understand, and from that data, you're trying to understand the theoretical underpinnings that is hiding in the data. So they were the original scientists and researchers to look at this from a different standpoint. And so that is how they started to create what is known as grounded theory method, or the formal grounded theory method. Anybody else? Because ऐसा है कि अभी तक देखिए कि मनाली की ये एक चीज मैं मान सकता हूँ कि इनका इंथुजियाज्म इतना ज्यादा है कि बोलने के बाद भी इन्होंने गोल्डन हैंड आप ही रखा है, नीचे नहीं किया.
Sorry, sir.
There you go. So anybody else who wants to take a little lead here? हाँ बोलिए. Yes, Akila, बोलिए.
Sir, on the chat, Mr. Prithvi Raj has written, grounded theory, it means to discover or make a theory from data using comparative analysis.
Okay, very good. Yes. Excellent. Excellent. That is the process by which you do it, by making comparative analysis. We'll talk about that in a bit. Who else? I want other students. There are so many, my goodness. अरे मेरी लिस्ट में तो कम से कम 26 से 27 स्टूडेंट थे. कहाँ चले गए सारे? Is everybody hiding? ये सब थक तो नहीं गए कि भाई ये तो लास्ट बट वन सेमिनार रह गया, तो आज इस सेमिनार में हम सिर्फ सोएंगे. ऐसा नहीं होने देंगे हम, right? So take a chance. So many other students are here. What do you think about this? You can either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and talk. It doesn't matter.
Sir, can I try?
Actually, you don't
My
have
name
to
is
ask.
Hadissa.
Hadissa, you
So
don't
I'm
have
not
to
very
ask my permission.
familiar.
Yeah, you
Yes,
don't have to
familiar
ask my
with all
permission.
of this.
Yes.
But the thing is, like yesterday, you said phenomenology. When you're collecting the data, then you're not trying to explain anything. You're just trying to understand the experience.
Exactly.
But in grounded theory, when the data is being collected, then we want to come up with something which explains the phenomena or what is going on. So for my understanding, I might be completely wrong, but like a theory banane ke liye data hai, but then we have to analyze the data to come up with maybe the common points or the common procedures or experiences there are, so that we come up with think, okay, if someone is going through this, so maybe this thing happens, or in this process ye sare steps hote hain. So for that, grounded theory is used. That is,
Absolutely.
I mean, that is my
Absolutely.
guess.
No, you are absolutely right. So what Hadassah has just come up with, that even though phenomenology and grounded theory are both inductive approaches, top down means you're talking from specific to general versus in deductive general to specific, right? So even though that is true, the whole process, the whole objective, the whole philosophy of grounded theory is so different from phenomenology. Phenomenology, if you remember correctly, I said it is a pre-theoretical endeavor. You do not use theory. You don't start think about theory until the very end. You allow whatever it is to emerge from the data that you're collecting. But what you're wanting to emerge from the data is not theory. It is how people are making sense of a phenomenon in its most primordial, in its most original form. You're not asking them, Harvey, in phenomenology, you're not asking a participant, okay, so you shared this life story with me, you shared this anecdote, or you shared this episode with me. What do you think is the theory behind it? You don't ask that, right? Even in grounded theory method, you don't ask the participant to tell you what is the theory. You ask the participant to help you understand what is the process they follow to come to a conclusion. How do they go from point A to point B? The hows start to get answered. How do they understand something from the standpoint of causality, one thing causing another? What is the correlation in their mind? So you go very, very deep into that. And remember that the people that the participants that you're interviewing in grounded theory are not theorists, but they are experts in their field, right? So understand something very subtle. In phenomenology, you are recruiting participants, not who are experts in their field, but who have knowledge about their field, who can speak authoritatively about the phenomena. Okay? So they speak with authority about a phenomena, whereas in grounded theory, you're looking for a slightly more advanced level of participation. Like, for instance, if you're doing a grounded theory method in a school system and understanding the processes that a school, whether it's high school or secondary school or what process do they use to onboard new kids who come in, starting from secondary, from nursery to secondary, and then what is the process of education do they work? So you may have to interview the the um, kindergarten school or primary school principal. You may have to interview the secondary school. And for instance, here there is the nursery, and then the lower KG, upper KG, first standard, second standard, third standard, and all that, which is part of the sort of like primary school. And then the secondary school is more all those grades up there. So you may have to understand how teachers, how administrators of the school make sense of the process that they follow. So you want to have in your recruitment pool participants who have in-depth knowledge about the phenomena that you're interviewing about or exploring. So understand that difference. I can take one more observation question. Thank you, Hadassah, for sharing that. It brought me into so many different things.
So I have a doubt.
Yeah.
So in phenomenology, we are interviewing people who have gone through the whole thing. But in grounded theory, it's not about the people who have experienced it personally, but on a higher level. Like one of your students आपने कहा था that she is in finding out about domestic violence during the pandemic in Meghalaya. So phenomenology में हम we go to each individual and we are trying to collect data about their experience. So in grounded theory अगर same चीज के बारे में करना है तो whom will we go to, like, collect the data in grounded theory?
So that is an excellent question. And is it Harissa?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Harissa, usually क्या होता है? The person who asks the question so passionately as the way you are asking usually has the answer already ready. But वो question इसलिए पूछते हैं to look very intelligent.
No, sir. I mean, what I
Tell me.
thought was the person who is interviewing all these people would be the authority. So next हम उनसे पूछेंगे for the grounded theory.
अरे
It was my
भाई,
assumption.
अरे भाई शर्माइए नहीं, शर्माइए, शाबाशी जब मिल रही है तो ले लीजिए ना, क्या फर्क पड़ता है? So you are asking a very pertinent question that let us take, for example, and let's pull in into this dialogue our dear friend and young student, Daka, if she's here. Daka, are you here? Is
Yes,
Daka
I'm
here
here.
today?
Yes,
Daka,
sir.
Daka, did you hear what Hadissa just said?
Yes, sir. I heard her. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Okay, so now Daka, I know you're pursuing phenomenology in which you're simply understanding the essence of the Meghalayan women who are undergoing domestic abuse, their experiences, right? But if you were approaching your study from a grounded theory method, your
Yes, sir.
question, your research question might have been, what are some of the factors that led you to do this or led you
Yes,
to
sir.
take some? So how would the same participants that you've recruited for the phenomenology, would there be the same participants from a grounded theory standpoint?
Sir, I think in grounded theory, we could take a participant who has experienced that and participant who have not experienced that, sir.
वो तो मैं समझ रहा हूँ, but grounded
Okay.
theory में आप Dhaka, you understand Hindi, right, Dhaka?
A little, sir, yes.
Okay, let me try it in English. So in Dhaka, what we are trying to do in grounded theory is we are trying to understand a process. We are trying to understand the factors that come into play.
The causal factors, sir. Yeah.
Causal,
Okay.
exactly, causal factors. अरे भाई क्या बात है? आपसे next segment करवाएंगे. Causal factors. So you are trying to understand causality in grounded theory. Why?
Yes,
Because
sir.
you're trying to understand what is the process they follow. So let me take an example. If you were interviewing for a grounded theory method, you were interviewing Meghalayan women, you were not simply interviewing them to share their experiences with you about domestic violence.
No, sir.
Your objective in grounded theory becomes different.
Yes,
In
sir.
grounded theory, you're trying to understand what were the facts. I'm just taking an example here. Okay,
Yes,
don't
sir.
take this personally. I'm taking what factors led them to suffer, and at one point decide that they could take it no more, and they divorced the husband, right? And they decided to do something on their own. Let's say they became entrepreneurs. They took the child with them and they said, I can't deal with this pressure, distress anymore. I am going to go divorce and start my own little shop or whatever, because so that I can become independent. Right? Because they were totally fed up of all this domestic violence that was going on. So
Yes,
what were the factors that led them to make such a giant
decision,
leap of faith? Now, to have that, you would have to have participants, Meghalayan women, who have had the
Have
same
gone through.
experience, who did the same
Yes.
thing.
Yes,
Hadassah,
sir.
you know, Hadassah, can you see where I'm going with this?
Yes, sir. But
Okay.
can you like thoda or I'm getting
Ah,
there, like people
okay.
with common experience, they are coming together. But I have
Okay.
a question. So when this is
Huh.
happening, we are trying to understand domestic abuse. So are we only going to see this one side where the women are suffering, or can there be another side where we involve, if possible, the men to ask them what led them to do this?
Wonderful, wonderful.
Because
क्या बात है भाई,
abuse के
आज तो
बारे में
क्या बात है,
abuse के
गद्दार
बारे
से
में
आप
समझने के लिए तो
ये
yes
अब
sir I'm
ये
sorry
ये तो मैं पूछ भी नहीं सकता कि कहाँ से सूरज निकला, क्योंकि आपके लिए तो शाम पड़ गई है, राइट? तो
yes sir
पहले मनाली बोलना शुरू करी, फिर हडसन ने हुआ, and now Dhaka is come into the picture. तो हम क्या करेंगे
Sir,
भाई?
सर आप एक्सप्लेन करेंगे हम सबके क्वेश्चंस लेके
अच्छा, तो वही तो कर
हम
रहे हैं
सबके
हम.
डाउट्स
So
या सर
so so you have brought in a very critical aspect, which is not true in phenomenology. In phenomenology, in order to understand the lived experience of Meghalayan women, it is not necessary to bring in the lived experience of Meghalayan men.
yes okay
You know, and the reason for that is why, because you don't mix it up. What is your phenomena there? The phenomena is domestic abuse of Meghalayan women. You want to hear from their own thoughts, right? What is happening to them, not what is happening to men. Whereas in grounded theory, you may like to bring participants who are male, who can help you understand this domestic abuse. Both, by the way, may have the same phenomena, domestic abuse. But in the case of grounded theory, because you are going so deep into exploring the factors, you don't bring in the men, Harissa, because you don't
okay
believe the women.
yes
You don't do that to that. You want to bring in a deeper perspective,
okay
because you're trying to understand what causality, what led them to do that, and what do the men, whether the men have enabled them to do that, or whatever is happening. So yes, you can do that.
okay
So does that understand does that help you a little bit
yes
on that?
yes sir it does
Because
thank you
you're
sir
trying to explore causality there. Yeah, you go ahead.
So just one question. Actually, not a question, but I just wanted to ask you this. So when I said that we can take up participants who have not experienced that, that's what I meant. So like asking, the abuser to like what made them do this certain, what made them do this certain thing, or what caused them to act this way. That's what I meant by calling participants who have not experienced. But like you said, they have also experienced that phenomena, and you've already given me that answer. So, sir, so that's possible in grounded theory only, right?
Yes. So again, there are very innovative, creative methods of doing both grounded theory and phenomenology. And we're not talking about the very advanced methods of doing it. Let's right now remain at the basic level. Okay? Because you have to learn to have baby steps before you can start to walk and start going. Because I don't want you to confuse you with modalities that are very complex in both grounded theory and remember yesterday's conversation. Dr. Tripathi had asked, why isn't it possible, or is it possible to have just one participant phenomenology and IPA? And I said yes. But is it going to be the norm? No. You're not going to be able to convince your dissertation committee, okay, to have you just conduct one interview. अरे भाई डाका एक ही इंटरव्यू करके छूट गई, अरे भी 10-15 करिए ना, उसमें तो डेटा कलेक्ट होगा. Whereas if Dhaka were an experienced researcher in phenomenology, years and years of experience. And you were doing, remember I gave you the example of Gandhi ji?
Yes,
You
yes.
could be doing a phenomenological study based on just one stalwart, one distinguished personality, right?
Yes.
So, and it could be, and somebody mentioned, I think it was Dr. Krishna or Dr. Prashant was one of the to mention about it. Could feel like a biography. Whereas
Yes,
when we are doing research, we would not call it a biography, but it can have some essences of biography in a manner of speaking. Okay. So
okay, sir.
let's move on. Let's move on. Thank you. This was an excellent
Thank you,
discussion.
sir.
Everybody, I thoroughly enjoyed this. And you have to understand something about me. One of the things that is keeping me young is that I've not forgotten what it means to have fun. Okay. If I can't laugh at myself and if I can't laugh at the life experiences in the world, then I would get old very quickly. So I don't want to be like that flickering candle, बुझती हुई मोमबत्ती, जो किसी time भी बुझ जाएगी. So, so I'm trying to remain as vibrant, as energized as possible. So thank you all for sharing that segment. It was excellent. Manali, Hadassa, Dhaka, and others. So that was great. I really enjoyed that piece. You got us really kicked off, started off really well into grounded theory. So let's go to the next slide. Okay. Uh, Grounded theory, you will understand, in order to understand grounded theory better, you have to understand certain terminologies. Induction, I've already talked about, it's an inductive approach from specific to the general, starts with very specific cases. Specific cases, what are the cases? The cases are the interviews that you're doing, in-depth, semi-structured interviews. And remember one thing, very big difference between phenomenology and grounded theory. In phenomenology, typically you do one solid in-depth interview, whether you do it face-to-face or you do it through Zoom, recorded interview, or you do it any other method, but it is just one interview typically, unless you're doing a series of interviews where it gets into a very creative design. I don't want to get you confused with that. Okay. Introduction means from general to specific. We already talked about that. It starts with general observation, a general theory, and how to apply it to a specific demographic problem, a socioeconomic problem, right? So that is how we work with positivist thinking, positivist approaches, quantitative approaches. You will hear of another very new expression, which none of you probably has heard of, or maybe have heard of, but in a different way. Abduction. Arey bhai, don't think of abduction as you were abducted by aliens from outer space. This wo abduction nahi baat kar raha hai. You're not being abducted by them. This is a concept in grounded theory. It starts with an observation. Think about, you were just starting this research, Manali, and you wanted to do grounded theory, right? You would use a process of abduction. And what is that process, Manali? You start with an observation. You observed something. How do you observe something? You've been reading up about it. You've been talking to people about it. You've been understanding it through news groups, through whatever. You start with an observation, then attempt to find the simplest, most plausible explanation to that. So very soon, Manali, I will try to put you on a spot again. But let's say right now, you start with an observation, then you attempt to find the simplest, most plausible explanation. And you're thinking that I have this phenomena that I'm looking at. How can I explain the process or what is happening in the phenomena in its most simple form? Or can I do it? Is it possible to look at it in its most simple forms? You consider all possible theoretical explanations. So then you start looking at the phenomenon. You look at the literature, you see, is there anything written on that? Is there any theoretical explanation on that? Things of that nature. So you look for all possible theoretical explanations for the data, forms hypothesis for each, then pursues the best course of action. So you start to form a hypothesis in your mind. This is before you've even started the study. Because remember, it's very critical before you embark on a grounded theory study to know what it is that you're trying to form the study around. What are some of the, have you understood the concept in its entirety? Have you read up some literature on it? Or is it something that just occurred to you, something that you've been observing day to day and have not been able to truly understand in its most theoretical sense? So abduction, remember, abduction is a process of thinking, just as though induction and deduction are processes of thinking, process of analyzing something, processes of developing a framework, developing a design. So if you understand that you have to pursue the best course of action, the best course of action is yet not available to you to pursue that phenomenon. And you're wondering, you're thinking about it, then you say, I would like to do a grounded theory study on this, because this area of study is fascinating to me. I want to understand better what's going on. Okay. So just understand these terminologies. They're going to be important to you when you do your study or you start your research. So grounded theory is a systematic methodology. Now remember, yesterday I was talking about phenomenology being more of a philosophy rather than a methodology. In grounded theory, the reverse is very true. The methodology comes first, and then out of that emerges the philosophy. Okay? So grounded theory is a systematic methodology in social sciences involving the construction of theory. You're constructing in your theory through what is grounded in the research data itself. As Manali said, and others joined in, that it is already in the data. You're trying to uncover a theoretical framework, a way of describing a causality, the factors, or the process through the data. It's hard work. So why do we say grounded? Because it is grounded in the data. What is the data? The data is the interviews that you conduct and the information that you collect, right? It is not just experiences, mind you, maybe it's a very different approach. Your in-depth analysis or in-depth interviewing is not about tell me more about that experience. Tell me a little bit more about that experience. Yes, you're going to go there, but your questions become different there. Tell me the process that you followed. But what do you mean by the process, Manali? You said you did this as a Maghalian woman. You were suffering this abuse for a period of time. Then you decided that you could take it no more. So tell me, what are some of the steps that happened in your mind that led you to take this risk, take a chance? Okay? Because you're trying to understand causality. You're trying to understand the factors A, B, C, D that led you to make that decision to become an entrepreneur and leave this marriage. I'm taking an example. It could be something else. So grounded theory is in and about the data. It is always, always, always about the data. You do not bring in any outside understanding to it. You do not bring in any outside frameworks into it. And then you will remember one thing about this. In this approach, unlike most other methodologies, the bibliography and literature review is not done first, it is done last. The references are done last. The bibliography is created last. Can anybody tell me why it is important in grounded theory to do that later than do that first?
So can I say?
Yes, go ahead.
So if we are already looking at all the theories there are about a particular phenomena, so when we are looking at the data, so that will come up. But if we want to make a new theory out of it, or we are understanding it from a newer perspective, then first we need to understand what is coming up from the data, and then checking whether that kind of theory or explanation is already there or not. That is what I understood. I
Very,
might be
very
wrong.
good. Very good. You don't want your mind to be prejudiced.
Yes.
You don't mind, you want to, so in a sense, it's like almost like bracketing yourself from what you already know. So
Yes.
you can't now, one thing, there's a debate always in grounded theory. Can you really keep yourself away from your understanding of a phenomenon? No, you cannot, right? Because you already also know something about something, and you have some formulation in your mind about how that is happening. So, however, what you're trying to do is, to the extent possible, you're not immersing yourself into the literature. You're not reading up about it too much. You're not forming a bibliography first, a literature review first. You're just collecting the data. You're like a child going out there in a candy store and trying to experiment, or into a toy store and trying to see new toys happening. And how does one thing work? How does this thing fit into this? You know, those little blocks. So you have the mind of a child in grounded theory. And remember, in grounded theory, even though you are a co-participant in the creation, the actual creation of the theory is coming from the data. And what is that data? The data is data is what you're collecting from the interviews. It does not seek grand theories that may not have anything to do with a particular study. So you're not looking out there for grand theories. That's why you keep your literature review to the very end. It is an inductive approach to doing research, so we talked about that. Grounded theory concepts. Unlike traditional methodologies, grounded theory does not begin. So I've already talked about what was going to come in the next slide. So here it is. Does not start with existing theoretical, meta-theoretical frameworks or design, right? Meta means beyond theory. So you're not really going so deep into that already without collecting data. Everything emerges from the data. The researcher does not start with I just talked about that. It typically comes last after the data has been collected and when wants to make comparisons between emergent and extant theories. So when you have created a new framework based on this study, when you go to the end, that's when your faculty sign that they are saying that that you are making a comparison between that. Okay, all right. So in order to make that comparison, you have to have the theories that are present there already about your phenomena. Then you might say, oh my goodness, so I have done this entire study. My data is already telling me more of the same. Somebody has already written about this. Somebody has already done research about this. Then you have to go back into your study and possibly do more interviews, collect more data in order to see If there's anything new coming out, remember the goal is not just to produce a brand new theory. It could also be to refine an existing theory. But how would you know whether you're producing a new theory or refining an existing theory until you have read up the literature? So one might ask, so why can I not do the literature review? And Hadasa, this is for you. Why can't I do the literature review first so that I don't get into that situation later? What do you
Hello.
say, Hadasa?
So I don't know, but if generally if I am looking about the factors affecting a particular thing, and if I'm reading all the theories, there are existing theories. So most of the time, if I'm not critical enough of what I'm reading, or if I don't have that ability to find out that this theory is missing something, and I might find something if I'm looking at the data again, so I might just miss out the whole point. Matlab, then I might think that the existing theories are there and they're doing a fair job of explaining the things, and I need not do the theory. I mean, if I was there and I was doing something and already itna sara kaam ho chuka hai, I might not go through the labor again to find out what is there new in it. So
Exactly. It's the labor required. It's the grunt work required in grounded theory. The very essence of grounded theory is this grunt work. Grunt work meaning this heavy lifting that you have to do before you can come up with some brand new way of explaining something. So so as Gadasa said, you may not want to do that if you've already done the work upfront. You may say, hey, if I read up the bibliography, read up the references, and I might say, छोड़ो यार, ये इसमें क्या करने का grounded theory, कुछ और कर लेते हैं. Let me do action research, let me do ethnography or whatever, right? So there is a certain mindset of a researcher. There is a certain kind of researcher who's drawn to grounded theory. It is not everyone's piece of cake. Please know that. And again, maybe I'm repeating myself, and I think I am, that I would recommend only doing a grounded theory if you're prepared for this kind of grunt work, this kind of heavy lifting. If you're not, and then if you have time on your hands, because you may take, if you're doing a master's degree and you're doing a grounded theory, full-blown grounded theory, in 2 years, so you may get to the point of actually starting to collect data. So unless you're doing, and if you're doing an accelerated grounded theory method, yes, we can do that. And I've helped students do that. But you must be prepared that there is a lot of work required in grounded theory method. Okay, so you should be ready for that work. Categories, coding, constant comparative analysis. Just I want you to understand some key expressions, key terms here. What are categories? Categories are grouping together of instances, events, processes, and occurrences that share central features. Now, think of this as a transcript that you've created from a grounded theory interview. Grounded theory interviews are also long interviews. As a matter of fact, they are longer interviews than the typical phenomenological interviews. Phenomenological interviews can go from an hour to hour and a half. Grounded theory could go 2 hours or even more, because you're trying to understand factors. You're talking to these authority figures who have expertise in that. When I say authority figures, I don't mean all CEOs. It could be an administrator who knows the process better than the CEO. And if you're trying to understand the process, do you go to the CEO or do you go to the administrator? You go to the administrator. So you're recruiting administrators to the study who can help you understand, and I'm talking about school administrators, university administrators, who know the process from A to Z, who have been doing it on a day-to-day basis. And you're trying to get into their minds to understand what is the process that they're following, right? So if you have a transcript, you look at the transcript, you read the transcript, you reread the transcript, then you form categories, okay? It's almost like a coding. So you forming grouping together of instances, events, processes, and occurrence that have shared central features. These are sort of like, think of them like emergent themes that are emerging. Now, categories, now here's a very important aspect which you didn't find in phenomenology when I was talking about it yesterday. Categories may be at a lower or higher level of abstraction. We use the word abstraction a lot. Abstraction is that you're using something that is, almost think of it as the opposite of a very deliberate, very structured kind of process where you're going linearly, you're following a structure. Abstraction is you're thinking and analyzing in your mind what's going on. Okay. So, how do you separate a lower category of abstraction to a higher category of abstraction? Let's take a look at that. A low abstraction category serves as a descriptive label. You will hear the expression descriptive label, such as anger, pity, etc. So it can be something else in your study. But let's take the example of an emotion. You were dealing with an emotional, so you were looking at what inspires, let's say, what factors inspire a transgender woman or man to want to become self-sufficient and independent? What are some of the factors that they went through? Or what are some of the factors that can explain what happens to them? They want to go to school, they want to have degrees, they want to get into the workforce. How do they meet and encounter those challenges? What goes about and what is the process that they follow to become entrepreneurs? So in that, there's a lot of emotion that might come in. And the emotions and anxiety around marginalization, about being misunderstood by the cisgenders, by those that were born with a certain biological sex and chose to remain in that gender for the rest of their lives, right? So they are being misunderstood by cisgenders. They are being misunderstood by the government, and they are left in isolation because a lot of stereotyping happens to them. I mean, a lot of people are not comfortable with the visual of a person who is clearly has masculine features, has a shaven face, right? Has the features of a man, and yet is wearing earrings, wearing a sari, or wearing a Punjabi suit. It's jarring to the senses, right? So if you were doing a grounded theory study, would you not agree that there's a lot of emotion and feeling that might come in? Feelings such as anger, pity, tenderness, resentment, hatred. Somebody might say, I'm taking an extreme example. Somebody might say, oh, who is it? Because that person as a child has experienced transgenders as coming out at weddings and clapping and singing songs and threatening people if they don't give them the money. That's the stereotype. So the question is, you want to understand from the mindset of these people, what is the process that they're following? Because you just don't want to do more of the same. There's a lot of studies done on marginalization and other facets of the transgender community. You're trying to understand their resilience, let's say. You're trying to understand what is it that makes them want to become entrepreneurs? What is the process that they follow? So obviously you're going to recruit transgenders who went from that transition and have become entrepreneurs. It doesn't matter whether they've become wealthy or unwealthy or whatever. You're trying to understand the process of their mindset. So a lot of those emotions can come into that. You would categorize as low abstraction. The feelings, the emotions, you create a descriptive label, you use a coding with a marker, a yellow marker, pink marker, blue marker, and code it as a descriptive label. You say, okay, this is anger. It is coming out in the interview as anger, resentment. You're only describing that feeling, describing that emotion. Higher abstraction categories are analytic, having coded those feelings separately in your transcript. How do you then analyze and interpret those feelings? Then the question comes in, the why. Why is this happening? And in order to understand the why, you cannot be fully interpretive until they tell you why this is happening to them. You can't just form your own judgment and say because they're being marginalized and because of that is why they're feeling resentment, that is why they're feeling anger, that's why they're feeling shame or whatever. You have to be open to what they are telling you, because guess what? You're already collecting data. And the more and the richer your data, the better your framework will be. And you have to collect a lot of the data. Unlike in phenomenological interviews, where you go in once for a 90-minute interview or 2-hour interview, you're done, and you come out of there. In this, you may have to keep going back 2 or 3 times sometimes to collect more data in order to reach a data saturation, where it's like the marginal utility, that any additional data does not significantly contribute to your study. You already have collected, how you reach the saturation point. But to reach the saturation point, you have to go through a lot of steps. So coding is a process by which categories are identified and divided into low and so this process that I developed will help you see lower abstraction and higher abstraction. You separate them through a process of coding. So you have a different coding color for each of them in the transcript. In analysis of data, descriptive labels are initially attached to low categories, which I just talked about. As analysis progresses, now, by the way, this is constant comparative analysis. One thing you will understand, in phenomenology, you're doing analysis at the end of the data collection. Here, the analysis is ongoing. You're constantly going through this analytic process. Okay? So as analysis progresses, means as it is going on, coding identifies data that share characteristics of high abstraction, where interpretation of labels can begin, such as what does this anxiety represent? What does this shame that was shared by the transgender individuals represent? And how does that shame connect with what is unfolding as a process? Or how does it connect with the factors that is wrong? Is it the shame that is causing them to do something? Is it the marginalization, the feeling of being subjugated, the feeling of being treated as less human? I mean, I know that the Indian government has a law that has been passed and it's called the third sex now, or third gender, I believe. Sorry, not third sex, third gender. It's okay. But if it's called a third gender, some transgender individuals may not feel comfortable being labeled as third gender. So they are feeling upset about this. And is that what is causing them to rise up and become more independent, to come as become members of a society like everybody else, to feel like a like an equal? Okay. So a coding process that maintains momentum by moving back and forth between convergences and divergences. So through the coding process, coding again was separating higher categories, lower categories of abstraction. Through color coding, you're looking for convergences, agreements, and disagreements. Both are important, right? Because you want to have a justifiable study, something that is rationally driven, theoretically driven. It is not judgmental. You're having a great deal of objectivity into this. Unlike phenomenology, where there was a great deal of subjectivity. The way you deal with ground theory studies, you remain subjective to open up a conversation to go deep. But the data that you try to collect has to be data that can be objectified to some point. When I say objectified, not in terms of numbers, it's still non-numeric, but by objectification, I mean that you can make some sense of that data in terms of the process that they're following, in terms of the factors that you're exploring. It ensures that the researcher is not only accumulating categories, but also categorizing into subunits. So remember, like I told you in phenomenology, where you're clubbing together the emergences or clubbing together the themes into smaller. So we told you one transcript starts with 25, then becomes like only 10. And then when you look at them further, it may only be 7 or 8 themes around the phenomena. Everything else that they're talking about has a duplicity. So you club them together because you're not looking at everything and anything coming out. You're looking at certain categories. Why? Because you're distilling them through a process of phenomenological reduction. But here, you don't break them up into subunits in order to make some general observation. You break them into subunits because it's easier to handle that data that is coming. Because at that some point you're going to make, and it is beyond the scope of the seminar to show you the schematic that can be followed. Many people have developed it. And I have another PowerPoint by Cresswell in collaboration with another scientist that I'll share with you in a few moments on how some of the frameworks can be developed in terms of diagrams. But let's for right now look at this. It ensures that the research is not only accumulating categories, but developing them into smaller units. The goal is not get into a homogeneous mindset. You're not creating similarities through this process, but you're allowing for all complexity to make its way into the emergent study or emergent theory. You're allowing, as a matter of fact, you're almost inviting more and more and more complexity. Can anybody tell me why, unlike phenomenology, why in grounded theory we are inviting so much complexity into it? Why? Are we just crazy? Would we have nothing else to do with our lives? Because usually the process is you make complexity simpler. You don't make what is simple into what is more complex. That is what you're doing in grounded theory. You're creating complexity. Why? Why do we create complexity in grounded theory method? Anybody?
So
Yes.
it is to basically not skip any perspective or not skip any reason or any factor for that phenomena. So
Right.
only if we look at only the homogeneous reasons or the common reasons, we
Mhm.
will miss out on even that one single unique reason that may be contributing to the phenomena.
Ah, nice. Nice. I like that. That is awesome. So don't want to miss out on anything. You want to create a an atmosphere of complexity so the data is complex when you break it down then into try to understand you're not leaving out any perspectives. Thank you. Well said. Anybody else? Why do we invite this complexity into grounded theory?
Sir, I am. May I speak, sir?
Who's this? Krupa? Yes,
Sir
of
Krupa.
course.
Sir, also to see the intersections between the factors, not just describe the factors as it is, but how they're interplaying with each other and how they create a phenomenon. I mean, how they create concepts within themselves also.
Ah, nice. Did everybody hear what Krupa said? Can anybody help me understand better what Krupa just said? She said something very profound.
So can I
So,
try?
yes, so what is the intersectionality she's talking about?
Thus, as let's take the example of the women who are suffering from abuse, domestic abuse.
Yes,
So who are coming out and becoming entrepreneurs because they are leaving their husbands and they are finally becoming financially independent.
correct?
So it's not one factor that they lacked money which made them into going to become an independent person. It was the abuse that they felt shame that okay, I'm not doing anything and my husband is beating up because I don't have a backing of myself. So shame was one thing. And then whenever the husband was there at home, they would feel anxious. So there's anxiety there and the helplessness there. So if we see them as just individual parts, we'll not be able to have a full picture. She was feeling shameful and she was feeling hopeless and she did not have money, but it's not just one factor which will explain why she became an entrepreneur or why she left the husband. It was all the factors together. Like मेरे पास पैसा नहीं है, मुझे इज्जत नहीं मिल रही है, और मेरा पति मुझे he's abusing me as well because and I have no place to go or escape. So that's why all these factors together, they came together, and then she took the step forward कि I have to break from this and I have to do something of my own. So when we are looking at all the points for a theory, then we need to look how each of it like, yeah, as Krupa said, the intersections between all of it together, and then we can have a full picture of what's going on, to my understanding, if I'm right. Krupa.
Very, very well. Krupa, do you agree? Do you agree that the way Arasa has explained what you were trying to say?
Yes, yes, sir. I'll also add one example, sir.
Yes, go
So
ahead.
last year, there was one girl who was, so we had one project she was doing on misuse of Section 498A. That is the section which is the Dowry Act in India. It is known as, so it is a pro-women act.
Okay.
So one of the intersectionality, or as I say, concepts forming within among themselves, was that we understood that legal provisions were available for women but not for men. So we reduced it to as justice to one gender does not mean that you do not have justice for another gender.
Ah, nice. Nice. So you
So
see this complexity. If you notice that conversations around grounded theory method are so different from our conversations yesterday around phenomenology. Does everybody is everybody seeing that? Not that the conversations yesterday lacked any depth. They were also deep, but they were deep in a very different way because the philosophy and the underpinnings of phenomenology and IP, etc., are different from the underpinnings and philosophy and methodology of grounded theory. Have you seen how how much deeper we have to go into making those connections? Not that in phenomenology you don't go deep, but in this you're going deeper theoretically. In phenomenology, you're going deeper emotionally. You're going deeper into this theoretically because even though they're sharing those emotions with you, you're always keeping in mind your objective of doing the grounded theory, which is what? To either craft a brand new theory or brand new understanding of a process or phenomena, or to refine what has already been done because you felt that it does not properly explain that. And most grounded theories that are done, studies, are about the latter. They're refining an existing theory. Nobody is going out there to challenge Newton or challenge Einstein. And there may be a few, but more often than not, we are doing the latter. We are refining existing, which is pretty good, which is a great objective to have. So let me move on. The researchers immerses in data and looks for negative cases. Now you'll hear one more expression in grounded theory. It's called negative cases. It's the same thing as the opposite of positive? No. The negative cases are categories that do not fit. If some of you that have done statistical analysis or into mathematical analysis, you know what is known as an outlier. Or if you've done Six Sigma, you know there's a regular dispersion, and then there are some that are outliers, some dots that do not fit in there, right? And these are the dots that you also have to identify. Because the outlier, and especially if there are more than one or two outliers or three outliers in a study, you can't just dismiss them and throw them away because they don't form part of the normal dispersion. You have to look at the outliers in their own terms to understand what influence, if any, do these outliers have on your study. So these instances are identified and explicated in analysis. Explicated meaning you're explaining them in your analysis that, yes, I was doing this study, but I felt some of these outliers, these dots that were outside of the normal dispersion. They were neither convergences nor divergences. There was something odd happening there. I'll give you a quick example. When I was doing my doctoral study on negative capability, which is a very abstract sort of phenomena by John Keats, the famous English romantic poet. And the phenomena really says it's the capacity to stay in mysteries, doubts, and uncertainties without the irritable reaching after fact and reason. Remember, I was talking about being at the edge of certainty and uncertainty. Very difficult place to be at the edge of certainty and uncertainty. So as I was doing my study, I found a major outlier there. It came up only in one interview out of my 14 interviews. One lady that I was interviewing, who was originally from UK but lives in the US now, both her sons are suffering from acute OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, to the point that they are so debilitated they don't leave the house. Both, and by the way, grown-up sons in their 20s. It's genetic, there's something happening there. And one of the son constantly counts backwards from 100 to 1, thinking that if I stop counting from 100 to 1, the house might burn down, or there may be a fire in the house. The other son of hers, who's also suffering from OCD, is constantly rubbing his hands. And he feels whether it is summer or winter, he feels that if he stops rubbing his hands like this, something catastrophic can happen. So as I was interviewing her, she made connections between negative capability, my phenomena, research phenomena, and OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Obviously, the mother of two grown sons who are suffering from acute OCD is a very concerned mom. She's attending international seminars to understand OCD because she wants to help the sons. She's helpless. She's getting them therapy. She's getting them medication. And they're showing some signs of it, but they are debilitated. Can you imagine grown-up sons staying in the house? It is not the norm in the US. They are in their teens, children are leaving the house and going for further studies and everything else and getting jobs and going out of the house. And even in India now, you're getting educated and you want to go out and be on your own, independent, because it's no longer the case that if you were born and raised and educated in Delhi, your job will also be in Delhi. Your job could be in Bangalore. Your job could be in Mumbai. Your job could be in Kolkata. So you go out. And she is seeing these sons suffer day in and day out. So she made strong correlation and connection with negative capability, my concept or study phenomena. Now, do I just dismiss that? It has nothing to do. My study is on the study of leaders and how they make sense of negative capability during periods of conflict and uncertainty in the workplace, because my phenomena research question was, what is it like for leaders to make sense of or of negative capability in periods of uncertainty and conflict in the workplace? So what has that got to do with OCD? So I asked my supervisor, I said, Dr. Silverman, this has come up, and what do I do with it? He said, does it pertain to your phenomena? I said, not directly. And he said, well, in that case, with all due respect to my supervisor, they said, why do you want to talk about it? It has nothing to do with your leadership studies. Now, when he said that, it made me wonder. So I further dipped into the literature and further looked into IPA to see what other researchers have experienced. And I found that when there is such a thing that is an outlier that comes up, it is known as a deviant finding. And a deviant finding in IPA must be reported in your final chapter, even though it does not have a direct correlation with your study phenomena. So folks, remember that something deviant, something outlier may come out in your study that has to be explained because it is forming a part of your study. It is happening so suppose you did 10 interviews or 15 interviews and you went back and did it again and again, and something was coming up there that was outlier, that was not fitting in directly into the causality or into the factors. And yet you couldn't help but notice that it was having some influence in the data. So you have to explain, you have to have a conversation, you have to have a discussion around that. Even if you say that I'm not taking that to be part of the study, you have to help them understand that it is coming up in the study. So researcher interacts with the data in order to identify low and high abstractions and framing, coding them into additional categories while remaining sensitive to the process. Okay, so I just wanted to share that because it's a very important aspect when you're thinking about grounded theory methods. Sampling. So we call it theoretical sampling and theoretical saturation. By the way, one of you has done some annotation there, like a yellow mark. Could you remove that, please? It's a little distracting. You've used the annotation feature on the slide, but not that it really matters a great deal, but it may be distracting to others. Sampling involves further data in analysis so that the emerging theories can be challenged. So what is sampling? Sampling involves collecting further data. We are collecting more and more data so that emerging theories can be challenged. This is a stage of refinement and transparency with the goal of reaching data and theory saturation. Okay. Saturation occurs when everybody has heard of saturation. Saturation occurs when no new categories, no new themes can be identified. Saturation is only a goal. It is not a finality. It is not a reality. For any modification changes will inevitably call for additional data, which may yield new material. What does it mean by that? So there is no such thing as absolute saturation in the sense that now I've reached the absolute saturation stage. No new data will provide any new material for me to look at. That is not the case. Because as you are doing the constant comparative analysis, you may discover an opportunity where you may need to collect more data because it is leading you somewhere and you need more material. So you may need to go back into an interview or do another set of interviews in order to analyze that. So there is no such thing as absolute saturation. Saturation is an ongoing process that can occur. There is a tentative nature of grounded theory, which I want you to understand. Let's read this together. When generation of theory is the aim, which it is in grounded theory, one is constantly alert to emergent perspectives. Emergent perspectives not only emerging in your own theory, but it also in the extant literature. So while you're doing research on your phenomena through grounded theory study, you may suddenly discover that somebody else is also doing a study on the same phenomena or somewhat similar phenomena. So you have to be aware of what's emerging out there and perspectives and what will change and help develop the theory. So these new perspectives can change the way you're going. It can change the way you're approaching this. Some new perspectives can develop. These perspectives can easily occur on the final day of your study. So folks, so let us say one of you is doing a doctoral study and you spent 3.5, 4 years now, you're going on finishing up the study. All the data is collected, your faculty members are on board with it, your committee is, and you have discovered something new, either a new theory or, which is more often the case, you might have a refinement of an existing theory. Now you're ready to pull the plug and say, I'm done, right? So these perspectives can easily occur on the final day of a study or when the manuscript is reviewed in page proof. So your manuscript has gone into a page proof, proofreading, and boom, all hell breaks loose and something happens that somebody either from your faculty committee challenges you or another academic challenges you, that what are you talking? And I'm not taking an example of Manali or Harasa or Krupa or Dhaka. That's not my point. I'm saying, but let me just take, for example, they might say, Krupa, you're ready to pull the plug right now. You're ready to publish this dissertation and to get it approved, but there is already work that has been done which is sounding so similar to yours. This group of researchers or this researcher has done work in your area. Are you aware of that? Because you're going to publish this work, Krupa, for the whole world to see your original work, and you're calling it your original work. But have you seen what has already been done there? That is similarly in process. Now, having said that, what I'm not suggesting is that now Krupa gives up the ghost and says, oh my goodness, now I can't graduate. No, it just is an invitation to Krupa to go back in and rethink that, relook at that. Because now remember, you're at that stage when you're doing a literature review. This is how you come up with that, because you're doing a literature review, right? Before you publish your study. So you may go in and you may say, okay, somebody else has done that work. So, and has been doing that work even before you started doing that. Say you were doing it in 2021 and somebody in 2015 had already written about that, which you were not aware of, because remember, you didn't read the literature before that. But now you're reading the literature. So you have to modify your study. You have to state in your final chapter that I was under the impression that no literature was available on this, but having done a literature review, I'm finding that such and such Taylor and Francis or whoever has done the work on this. However, and I would like to attribute them. However, my work was taking a slightly different direction. And here is the way my work differs from what they're writing about. Now you look at this from the standpoint of a rigorous, honest, when I say honest, I mean academically honest scholar. People will applaud you for that. People would say, wow, Krupa was able to analyze this, and Krupa was able to go back in and re-examine her study. Face the disappointment a little bit. I know it's going to be, I know how it feels. All of you, I've been there, done that. I know how it feels if on the last day somebody pulls the carpet from under your feet and say, wait, now let's wait a little, let's pause, let's spend